New Philanthropy Capital.
Great, so we've got people here from Italy, Scotland, lots of places. Great to see you all dialing in. It's one of the things we found is really nice about having the online events is we can get people who are coming from a bit further afield. So welcome. Right, I think we're up to 25 participants. We might get a few more people coming in, but I'm just going to take this opportunity to get started. Feel free to carry on posting in the chat if you haven't had a chance to do so yet. But just to say welcome everyone to the session and to introduce a few ground rules before we get kicked off. So I think everyone's fairly used to Zoom conversations by now, and it's great to see you already, lots of you using the chat. We will be using the chat throughout the session to have people asking questions. So please do, if you have a question that comes up as we go through, post a question in the chat. I'll try to pause at a few key points just to see what's going on in there and whether there are any points of clarification that people want answered. Do please keep yourself on mute unless you're speaking, and please keep conversations respectful and inclusive in the chat and elsewhere. Listen to other views and treat people with respect. This seminar is being recorded. Hopefully everyone's okay with that. And we will be sending out a follow-up email with the recording and further resources, including our post-event feedback survey. So do keep an eye out for that. But with all those in mind, I'm going to get started. So a little bit about NPC. For those of you who don't know us, we are both a consultancy and a think tank. We've got our roots in the grant making sector. We were really set up to help make grant making more effective. But over the years, we've evolved to do a lot of work alongside working with funders. We also now work with frontline charities. We work with policymakers. So we fit our work into three main buckets, as you can see here on this slide. We innovate. So exploring and developing new innovative approaches. We influence, and in particular, we're influencing policymakers to ensure that policy facilitates philanthropists, funders, and frontline charities to maximize social impact. And we improve, so particularly through our consultancy work and our research, we support funders, philanthropists, and charities to improve the way they work. And all of this is adding up to trying to support people and communities to improve their lives and also supporting the planet. And I'm Katie Boswell. I'm an associate director here at NPC. I've worked either with or for funders for about 15 years now. Previously worked for a small foundation based in California, and I've also been with NPC now for about 8 years. So this today's topic is very close to my heart, having worked on numerous theories of change, both as a funder myself and also working with funders who are trying to improve the way they think about creating impact through their work. So what are we going to be covering today? Hopefully we'll start with what is a theory of change? Some of you might have heard the term before, but we'll give NPC's definition and a bit of an explanation of the key features as we see them of theory of change. We're then going to delve into theory of change for funders specifically and think about how it can really help you to improve the way that you work. We'll spend a bit of time talking about developing a theory of change. Obviously, this is something that we could do a full day training program in, so it's inevitably going to be a little bit of a flavor of how you go about developing a theory of change, but we'll signpost to further resources for those of you who want to get stuck in and see a really step-by-step version of it as well. And last but by no means least, we're going to talk a little bit about how theory of change can help you. What do you actually use theory of change for as a funder? As I mentioned before, we're going to be using the chat to ask questions, so feel free to ask questions in that as we go through. And let's make it a little bit interactive as we go. So first of all, what is a theory of change? At NPC, we think there are 4 key features of a theory of change. So first of all, a theory of change describes how we think our activities will create the change we want to achieve. That's at the heart of theory of change. That's what it's really trying to do. It's very much thinking through how your activities go out there into the world to create the change we want to achieve. A core part of that process is that it encourages people to think about the intermediate steps as well as the underlying assumptions. I'll explain in a minute a little bit more about what we mean by that. Another essential feature is that it's both a process and an output. So when we say theory of change, people often think of the kind of diagrams that you might have seen for theory of change. That's a type of theory of change output, and it's very important. It can really help to communicate a theory of change, and it can be a shared document that you and your teams return to over and over again. But theory of change is also a process, and I'll talk a little bit about that today and how important the process is. It's also important to say what theory of change isn't. So theory of change provides a foundation for your organization's strategy, evaluation and learning and communication plans, but it isn't any of those things. It's not a strategy all by itself. It's not an evaluation plan, and it's not a communication plan. The beauty of theory of change is that it can support all of those and it can lead you to all of those, but it's important to distinguish between a theory of change and all of those things as well. So I'm going to cover these points in a little bit more detail now. First of all, as I said, theory of change describes how we think our activities will cause change in the world. So really here, you can see this picture of the rainbow, thinking very aspirational, thinking about the world and the change you want to see. It's important to step back from that using a tool like theory of change to think about and describe what you actually think will happen. So that's where the theory comes from. It's a theory for how you think your activities will cause change in the world. And important to say here, it is a statement of what you want to happen. It's a hypothesis. So they tend to be aspirational. You can do a theory of change for a program that's already running or even retrospectively, but its real power is doing it at the start of something where you're really trying to say what you think will happen, what you hope will happen. And it can be applicable to programs, projects, organizations, funding portfolios. There's lots of different levels you can look at within theory of change. Many funders we work with want one theory of change for their whole organization and the change they're trying to create, but they might also develop separate theories of change for things like their funding portfolios, where they want to go into a bit more detail about how their activities in that funding portfolio or that program will create change. But really, with all of this, it's important to focus on capturing the essence of your thinking. So we always warn people against sort of trying to capture everything in the theory of change. It's really that essential part of what you're trying to achieve. And again, talking about the intermediate steps. So what we often find is that funders have really clear goals and they have a clear set of activities that they deliver. That might be grant making activities, it might be capacity building or working with grantees and communities in other ways. But what's often missing is that really clear map of how those activities lead to the goals. And that's where theory of change comes in, is that it's really talking about what we call the intermediate outcomes. Again, don't worry too much about the terminology. I'm going to explain all of this a little bit more as we go through, but just important to note for now that it is this map of how you get there, how you get to your destination. It also explores the underlying assumptions. So we often see a version of a theory of change that goes a little bit something like this. Something happens and then a miracle occurs and the change we want to see happens. And what we really try to encourage organizations to do is to think about being more explicit about that black box in the middle. What's actually going on there. Yes, we might see our work in terms of miracles and magical things happening, but actually, can we start to unpick that a bit more? So that's where these question marks come in. We think that mentoring has an impact on reduction in youth unemployment, but how does it do that? We think that research might influence policy change. How does it do that? We think that campaigning might influence changes in public opinion, but how? And particularly relevant for funders, we think that making a grant might improve organizational effectiveness, but how does it do that? And how do we know? Those are the kinds of questions that theory of change can help us with. And again, I mentioned we often focus on the theory of change output. So a diagram like this, I'm not going to go into detail in this one, but this is some work we did with a program called the Countrymen's Club, run by a charity called Future Roots. And this is the kind of diagram that you might typically see. It's got the impact in purple on the right. Before that, it's talking about outcomes for the people involved in the program. It's got some orange boxes, which are what we call change mechanisms. Again, more on that later. And it's got some activities, so what the charity is actually doing. And that's a typical theory of change diagram. It's a slightly simplified one. We actually worked with this charity to also do a much more advanced one, which was for their own internal use. And this was the one that they developed, which was a simplified one for external use. But as well as the theory of change output, it's really important to think about the process, which in our experience can be just as valuable. Some of you might have heard of the IKEA effect, or if anyone's ever put together an IKEA piece of furniture, you might be familiar with the idea that you feel greater ownership of that piece of furniture and possibly greater commitment to it, whatever that means in the context of furniture, if you've been involved in the process. And this is very much the case with theory of change, what we see in our experience is that involving people sooner rather than later really helps to create buy-in and enthusiasm. So think about who the important stakeholders are for your theory of change. It might be your board, it might be your program staff, it might also be grantees or other stakeholders. Think about whether it's appropriate to involve some of those, and if so, how can you involve them and how can you get them enthused about the process as well? The process should aim to foster a shared understanding of your aims. So by bringing people together, you will identify areas of disagreement, which can also be really important, but hopefully you'll come out with a shared understanding of what you do agree on. Every now and then you end up with a theory of change where actually there's some slightly different views that are important to acknowledge in the end theory of change. And that can also be important, identifying those areas where people aren't quite sure. And maybe you want to do some further research to identify exactly how change happens in that particular area. So yeah, with all of this, it allows for reflection, discussion, and challenge of some of those assumptions. And hopefully all of this should make your plans more robust. It also puts you in a learning mindset, which, as we'll see when we talk about how you use theory of change, is an important first step for using your theory of change for learning, monitoring, and evaluation, and improving your impact as you go through. We talk about a few key ingredients for a good theory of change process. So we need someone who leads and brings it all together. In our work as consultants, we do a lot of this. It is possible to do that within an organization. I guess I would say from my own experience of trying to do a theory of change process from the inside of a funder myself, I felt that actually there are disadvantages to doing it from the inside. Ideally, the person facilitating wants to be neutral. And sometimes if you're there and you're actually a program staff member, you actually have a stake in it yourself and you want to be able to express your opinions. I would say think very carefully about that when you're thinking about who leads it and who brings it together. It should ideally involve some kind of consultation of stakeholders. As I said, you might want to include them more deeply in the process, but if not, you might also want to think, how can you get their opinions and views to lead in another way? Some people might do a grantee survey, for example, and then use that to feed into their theory of change process. And ideally, you also want to take a little bit of time to review the evidence base. This might be something that you already have within your organizations. You might already be familiar with the evidence base around your work. If not, then theory of change can be a really good moment to step back and do a little bit of work in just looking at what the evidence base is for your work. So with all of this, try to see the process, thinking about theory of change as separate from the output, which is describing how your activities lead to that change that you want to see in the world. And finally, as I mentioned before, it provides a foundation for these other plans. So this is an example taken from Sender Cow, and they've got a theory of change, which they use to inform their strategy and their prioritization of their activities. They also used it to inform their monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And they also used it to inform their communication plans through things like these nice infographics. So we'll cover this in more detail later on, as I mentioned, in terms of how you use a theory of change, but that gives you just a little bit of a flavour of the key features. So what does all this mean for funders? You might have noticed that the couple of examples I used there were both charities. And many of you might work with charities in your work who have theory of change. That is obviously an important dimension to thinking about how funders can make use of theory of change. But what does it mean for you as a funder when you're thinking about your own organisation, your own programmes, your own funding portfolios? It's important, first of all, to think about how funders create impact. And that's slightly different to how frontline charities create impact. So this is one of the diagrams we use to show the complexity of it. It sort of looks simple when you look at it to start with, but actually there's a lot of different layers here. There's a lot of different things going on. So a funder, most traditionally, a lot of grant making focuses on a funder funding charities and potentially other social purpose organisations that then have an impact on people and communities, that then have an impact on a social or environmental problem. So already there, you've got at least a 4-stage theory of change where you're thinking about how your funding goes out to charities and other organisations, how that impacts people and communities, and how that might impact on a social or environmental problem. But then a lot of funders do other activities aside from grant making. So they might fund people and communities directly, for example, providing scholarships for young people. And so then you've got an arrow down from the funder directly down to people and communities. Or they might fund charities and social purpose organizations that are more focused on things like research or campaigning, and might not necessarily have an arrow through people and communities, but might go, if you like, directly to that social or environmental problem. And then finally, funders themselves might be trying to directly influence a social or environmental problem. That might be through using their influence to try to campaign or influence other organizations, whether that's government, whether that's companies, whether that's other funders, or it might be through thinking about the way that they themselves work. So, for example, a lot of funders have joined the living wage movement, and they would say that that has hopefully an impact on improving people's lives directly and helping to address a problem such as the cost of living crisis, where people can't afford to make ends meet. So that arrow down to the left of the diagram is also doing a lot of heavy lifting there when we think about how funders create impact. And another thing to think about when you're thinking about how funders create impact and what kind of theory of change might be appropriate for you is that actually we have at least three, arguably more, types of funding that we see within our work. And there's a little bit of a spectrum here. So everything from responsive funding, where a flexible funder might have categories of funding fairly loosely defined and is funding applications that people submit, through to targeted funding, which is clearly defining the social needs that it's trying to fund and often has an established system of monitoring grants and looking at the impact on a particular issue, through to goal-oriented funding, which is often working towards goals in a clearly defined area, really needs a theory of change for how it's going to meet those goals, and is often proactive, looking for charities to fulfill those key outcomes and measure the impact of their funding. Those funders often see themselves as agents of change, so they'll often be using the kind of left-hand arrow that we saw on the previous slide to really look at the impact that they themselves are having on a social or environmental problem. Arguably, there's another step in the spectrum, which is systems change funding, and we're increasingly seeing funders talk about this in terms of their language. So not just goal-oriented, but how can they bring in systems change frameworks? I'm not going to cover that in a huge amount of detail today, but I think it adds an interesting dimension. And we've got a resource at the end that we'll share in terms of our work on theory of change and systems change as well. So I'm going to show you a few different simplified theories of change for these different types of funders to help bring all this to life a little bit before we go into how you might develop your own theory of change. This is an example theory of change for a responsive funder. So in theory of change, we like to look at the impact first. We like to have that as our goal that we're trying to work for. The goal of this funder is that the voluntary sector delivers a better service to users. They've deliberately kept it very broad because they're not necessarily looking to fund charities in one area or another. They're really looking to improve the impact of the sector as a whole. And so what might they do? What might their activities be to get there? Well, they might provide flexible funding, and they do this because they're wanting to see these outcomes. Charities are able to fund the work that they think is important. Charities are able to be more responsive to users rather than funders. That's their theory of change for how charities then create more impact. They might also be doing other things like using an evidence base and supporting charities to base their work on evidence so that charities do more of what works rather than what doesn't work. And they might well be providing funding to core costs. We've seen a lot of this in recent years with the response to COVID-19 and an increased emphasis on trust-based philanthropy and funding core costs. And the theory of change for this, for many funders, is that it supports charities to strengthen their core functions, plan over the longer term, and be able to take more risks. And then, I mentioned longer term funding as well. Also, clearly, there's an arrow in there to help charities to plan over the longer term. So this theory of change, as you see, is really about how the funder funds. And this funder has quite a clear theory of change for how their model of funding supports the voluntary sector to be more effective and deliver better services to users. And there's a sort of an implicit wider impact of this, which is that it improves the lives of people and communities. But this funder hasn't named that. They've just talked about the impact on the voluntary service, the voluntary sector itself. So important for you to think, for you, if you're thinking about your own theory of change, where do you sort of end that impact? Do you want to go as far as the longer term impact you're wanting to see, or do you just stop there? There's no sort of right or wrong answer on this. It's just what different funders find useful in terms of thinking about their impact. This one's a theory of change for a targeted funder. So this funder really wants to work towards more young people being in fulfilling jobs. And they do this through providing funding. They've got 3 different threads of funding that they provide. They provide funding for confidence building activities, with the idea that goes through charities. Charities support young people to increase their confidence, and young people have increased confidence to apply for jobs. Very similar for providing funding for skills development and work placements for young people. You can see that the outcomes there are focused on, first of all, the charities and what they do, and then what this means for young people. So this is a very simplified version of a theory of change for a targeted funder. In reality, the funder might have some more nuance in there. They might have, different work streams and different types of charities they work with and different outcomes that those charities work on. But this is a kind of giving you an idea of what that might look like. But this funder is mainly focusing in their theory of change, well, in fact, completely in this version of the theory of change, focusing on their funding that they are providing to charities. And that's subtly different to the next one, which is for a goal-oriented funder. Now, you might note that this funder has the same goal at the end. And in fact, they are also doing some of the same activities as the previous funder. So in the middle there, they are providing funding for work placements for young people. But actually, a lot of their work is also using their influence more directly. So they are producing research that influences government policy around skills. They are influencing companies to improve their offer for young people so that companies create more fulfilling jobs for young people. And they are thinking about how they themselves as an organization can have a direct impact on this social goal. So this foundation has created job opportunities for young people within the foundation itself. And it sees that as a core part of its theory of change and how its activities create this wider change that it wants to see. So you can see here how theory of change in different contexts for different funders can provide a useful tool for setting out how you think your activities go towards those outcomes and ultimately create the impact that you want to see in the world. So I'm going to take a quick pause here and just check the chat because I could see there were some things coming in. So great, it looks like Hector's already shared the report on theory of change for systems change. Thanks, Hector. So I'll move on at this stage, but if anyone's got any questions on any of that stuff I've just presented, feel free to keep posting in the chat, and we can always return to that section and any questions you've got about that later on in the seminar. But for now, I thought it's good to actually talk a little bit about the practicalities. So how do you go about developing one of these? We've seen the end product, if you like, looked at some of these different theories of change for funders. What is the actual process that you go through? And I guess with all of this, let me just move that slide on. There we go. With all of this, it's important to say that we use a lot of terms here, which are MPC terms, but they're also used by others in the sector. Some people use some of these terms in slightly different ways. We always say with our work, it's important not to get too caught up in the jargon and the language. It's actually much more important to think about the process and how you're thinking through all of these things. So I will be giving you definitions and I will be talking about the language around this and talking about the bits that we think are particularly important. But I would say don't worry too much if you're using some of these terms in a slightly different way. It's not really the term that's important, it's the process of thinking through and trying to get there in terms of understanding how your work creates change in the world. So we talk about theory of change as being a 3-stage or a 10-step process. And this is taken from our guide to theory of change in 10 steps, which you can see here on this slide. This actually provides a very clear step-by-step guide to doing your theory of change. So if anyone is wanting to work through this within your own organisation, that's a good resource to use. However, it's not tailored towards funders. So what I'm going to tell you today is a little bit more tailored towards funders. And in my experience of working with funders, some of them find that the 10 steps can be a little bit overwhelming, particularly working with the kinds of stakeholders that you might want to engage in your theory of change process, particularly if you're working with, for example, a trustee board that's got very limited time. Actually telling them that you're going to go through 10 steps and quite a technical process can feel like a bit too much, a little bit overwhelming. So what I would say to you is, in that situation, it's often more useful to think about it in terms of these 3 core stages. And what I'm going to show you today is a slightly simplified version of the 10 steps. So if you're sitting here thinking, I want all the 10 steps, go away and read the full publication. But I'm going to cover the core of it and what I see as the really useful bits for funders thinking about their work. So you can see here that stage 1 is a situation analysis. And this is really zooming out and thinking about the problem that you want to tackle, the wider context, some of the barriers and opportunities for change, the resources that you have, and where you can make the most difference. So for funders, an obvious resource is your funding, but you also have lots of other resources, whether that's your staff expertise or your trustees expertise, depending on what kind of funder you are. You also have a lot of power and influence potentially. NPC's published a report on funders thinking about power dynamics, and I think some of the things that came up in there can be very relevant when you're thinking about theory of change. So thinking about things like your convening power. Funders can often get people around a room that other people can't. Funders often have independence, so they're not the same as government or policymakers, but they can try to influence policy and be a bit more of a neutral space for some of those things to happen. So yeah, all of those things that you might want to think about when you're thinking about your situation analysis. It's then really important to, having considered this really wide situation analysis, actually zoom in. And this is where the core part of theory of change comes in. And there's a step-by-step process thinking about your target group. So for funders, your target group is often the charities or social purpose organizations that you are wanting to support with your funding or with your capacity building. However, as we've seen in the previous slides, you might have a target group that is people and communities more directly. So you might have more than one target group. You might even be trying to influence a group such as policymakers or journalists, the media, other funders. There's all sorts of target groups that you might have. And what we say, if you've got a lot of target groups, is it can be really helpful to do a theory of change for each target group. You might want to do one overarching one, trying to fit it all on one slide. But sometimes that could be a little bit overwhelming and you want to go into a bit more detail on, for example, how you work with policymakers or how you work with charities. So that's target group. Then for each target group, you want to think about the impact that you're wanting to have. And impact is a really long-term sustained change that you're seeking. I'll give you some more examples of all of these in a minute. You then go back to outcomes, the shorter term changes that you're trying to seek, back to your activities. As we saw in the previous slides, that could be making grants, it could be doing research, it could be working to influence other actors. And then we have something that we call mechanisms of change, or change mechanisms. The terms are interchangeable. And this is an often neglected part of theory of change that I'll come on to in a bit more detail later. But this is possibly slightly unique to NPC, or we place more emphasis on this than others because we think it's actually a really important part of theory of change. And you'll note that I didn't have any in the previous 3 slides where I showed you examples, but actually I think that's where those theories of change could be improved by really getting into thinking about the mechanisms of change, so how change happens. There's often then a step which is about sequencing these and putting them into a diagram for a theory of change diagram output. This is optional. Not everyone wants a diagram or needs a diagram, particularly funders. We often see funders having theory of change outputs that are more narrative based. That's absolutely fine as well. The examples I'm going to show you today tend to be diagrams, and we often find diagrams can be really useful as a visual output, but it is an optional output. So don't feel like you need to be held to a diagram. It's actually more important to do the thinking through and doing some kind of output where you share your hopefully shared understanding of how change happens. After all that stage 2 theory of change bit in the middle, we then suggest that you zoom out again and check back against the situation analysis and the wider context and think about your assumptions. So you've done your detailed theory of change about how you think change happens, but what are the assumptions? What are the things that might be helped or hindered by the outside world? And are there any weaknesses or risks that reveal your underlying thinking and things that you want to think about in a bit more detail? So that's the process in a nutshell. A lot to take in one slide. I'm now going to go and show you each of these stages in a bit more detail. So bring them to life a bit more. As I said, we recommend that you start with your situation analysis. This is part of the theory of change process that's sometimes skipped, but we argue that it's really important to take stock and reflect. And this can be particularly important for funders that are trying to have an impact on a particular social or environmental problem. It's a really important time to take stock and think about, what does that social problem look like? What does that environmental problem look like? What are some of the things within the wider situation that could influence our work? So as we say on the slide, try to put aside or suspend thinking about your own program or your own organization and just see the situation or the problem itself. And this is really about building the rationale for your work from the ground up. So kind of going back to first principles, what's going on out there? What is this rationale for our work? Where are we best placed to have an impact in this situation? A situation analysis is greatly enhanced if it is based on research, data, or evidence. Another good thing to think about is how you can bring in different voices within your situation analysis. So this could be a great area to bring in, for example, some of your grantees or some of the information that they've actually previously provided you with. So if you're a grant making funder, you might have got reports back from your grantees that have told you about the situation for them and what's going on in their world. They might also have given you information in their application forms about the context for their work. You will often find that you have a huge amount of research, data, and evidence already within your grasp, and actually going back and using that to draw on it for your situation analysis can be really powerful. If you have time, you might also want to do a more extensive exercise, such as a systems change funder might want to do a systems map. Again, we've got more sort of resources on this. We actually run a separate seminar thinking about systems mapping, if anyone would like more details about that. But essentially, it's about mapping the system around the social problem that you're trying to influence. So if you're a funder that's trying to influence homelessness, trying to support homeless people, a systems map might look at the kind of causes of homelessness and how you can influence those if you're wanting to prevent homelessness. It might also look at the system around a homeless person once they've become homeless. So what are the different services that they're accessing? What are the different things going on in their life? And therefore, how could your work support those people? So do you want to fund initiatives that are working on a particular area of supporting homeless people? Do you want to try to fund prevention? Do you want to try to go even further back in the chain and look at other services that might not seem to be about homelessness, for example, domestic violence prevention services, but because you know by doing your systems map that those are the sorts of things that drive people into homelessness. So that's a much bigger version. And again, I would say, think about involving different people in that if you're going to do it. Good practice if you're involving grantees or other charities or community organizations is to fund them where possible if you're asking for them to provide input, because otherwise charities can find themselves providing a lot of input for free. So I would again say, use what you've got in terms of research data and evidence from your grantees, or think about involving them and ideally paying for their time. So the output from situation analysis can then be used as an introduction to your theory of change. And as we'll see when we come to pulling it all together at the end, it's often a really important part, giving your theory of change some context. There's a few questions here that we suggest people think about if they're doing a situation analysis. So what's the scale of the problem and who is affected? This is really useful for then thinking about your target groups when you come onto theory of change. You might also want to think, what are the consequences of this problem and what are the causes? Again, this is getting slightly into systems mapping, but you can do a much simpler version if you don't have time for systems mapping by just asking yourself these questions. A lot of funders also want to think about, what are the barriers to success or the barriers to change, and what are the opportunities for overcoming these barriers? So in other words, how can our funding have most impact? Do we know where the opportunities are for really creating change in this area? And it's important to also think about who else is working to tackle the problem. So that could be other funders, or it could be other actors working in the space, and thinking about where are the gaps. So sometimes with funders, we would do a sort of an analysis of funding flows in an area or other funders working in the space and support them to think through where are the gaps that they could uniquely contribute to. And then last but by no means least, what resources do you have to tackle the problem? Where can you make the most difference with those resources? So there's no point in having a really ambitious theory of change that requires a lot of resources that you don't have. An important part of your situation analysis is to think about the situation for you yourself as a funder as well and your context. So you've done your situation analysis, you've zoomed out and you've thought about this really big situation, this really big wide context for your work. It could possibly feel a little bit overwhelming. And so this is a good time to zoom in and think about your theory of change. As you zoom in, it's important to think about where the boundary for your work is. So some of those prompts on the previous slide about where you are best placed to create impact, you might want to leave behind some of the wider situation analysis and just go, right, we're going to do our theory of change, but on this specific bit of the wider system. And we're going to bear in mind that wider context, but we're just going to put it aside for now because it's not really relevant to our immediate work. So then when you get to theory of change, these are the 5 components that we think are really important for theory of change. And I'll cover each of these in more detail on the following slides. Impact, as I mentioned earlier, this is all about the long-term or sustained change that you want to achieve for people and communities, or for a social or environmental problem, if you're a funder that's really focused directly on a social and environmental problem. Target groups, very linked to impact. These are the people or organizations that you're trying to influence. So the people and communities bit in the impact. Who are the actual people? You might go into more depth here about, for example, are you working with young people or homeless people, whichever is appropriate for your particular funding program. Outcomes. These are the shorter term changes in target groups that contribute to the impact. So these are often things that people achieve for themselves, such as knowledge, skills, and behaviours, but they contribute to this longer term impact that you're looking to achieve for people and communities more broadly. Activities, that tends to be a bit more straightforward. The activities that you or others, if you're doing a theory of change for a collaboration, the activities that you deliver. Although for a funder that's really starting from scratch, the activities conversation can obviously go into a bit more detail where you can actually spend quite a bit of time thinking through what activities you do want to deliver. And then I mentioned change mechanisms and how we think this is really important. This is all about how activities should be experienced by your target groups. So this is really talking about how those target groups are thinking and feeling, maybe what they're saying, what they're doing as they experience your activities. So for the responsive funder that we saw earlier, it might be that they think or they hope that their grantees are feeling trusted if they're a trust-based philanthropist. They might hope that those grantees are feeling a bit more in control of their future, able to take more risks, as it said in that previous theory of change. But it's really getting into the weeds of how people are feeling as they experience your activities. So starting with impact and target groups. And we always start on the right-hand side of the theory of change diagram and start with thinking about the impact, because it's really important to start with your goals. Those are the most important thing that you're trying to work through. And then we talk about working backwards from those goals. And what you often find is this can really help you to explore some of the underlying assumptions in your work. Often if people are working from left to right, they give a narrative which is, well, we do these activities, it creates these outcomes, that leads to impact. It's all very neat and tidy. If you work backwards from your impact, then you're actually challenging yourself to go, okay, this is the impact we want to see. What comes before that? What leads to that impact? And you might come up with some other outcomes that you hadn't thought of that then might lead to something new for you as a funder, for example, a new funding stream or a new type of activity that you realize actually you need to do to have the impact that you're wanting to see. So a few points to say about impact. Impact relates to your target group, not to you. So if you're doing a theory of change for influencing you yourself as a funder, your colleagues, that would look slightly different. We don't tend to see that. We tend to say, impact is relating to the wider world out there and the target group. But by extension, it can often relate to the community as a whole as well. That's optional. Again, it very much depends on the type of funder that you are. And it's really important that impact is important and meaningful. So for funders, you're often trying to tackle social change in an area such as some of these on the slide. You might be trying to reduce offending, increase employment, or improve well-being. Those are all things that are important and meaningful to you as a funder and to the people that you're working with. So that impact is often a really aspirational but motivating and meaningful expression of what you're trying to achieve. And then impact is long-term. So often it's something that's achieved after your program. So a good question to ask yourself is, how do you want the world to be better off in 5 years' time because of your work? And that might not be something that you'll immediately see as soon as you fund charities and programs. It might be something that happens as those charities create change, and as that in turn creates change for people and communities. So it's often something that people achieve for themselves after your work is finished. And it might well be something that you contribute to alongside others. So we often talk about contribution versus attribution when we're talking about impact. You might have heard those terms. Attribution is where you think you can directly attribute change to yourself. For funders and for organizations that are trying to influence the wider system, which funders often are, you're much more likely to be able to talk meaningfully about contribution to change, because you typically are not the only one funding in an area. You're not the only one contributing to change in an area. So, for example, if you're supporting a charity's work, it might be that that charity has 4 or 5 other funders who are also contributing to change. And that's a really important point. It makes your change and your ability to create change even more powerful through seeing what others are doing and how you are part of something bigger and contributing to that change. A couple of tips for impact: you want to be as succinct as possible. We recommend ideally 1 sentence. If you have to do 2, then do 2. It should be clear, jargon-free, and comprehensible. I've got a couple of examples here that we see that I think are arguably slightly woollier. So when people are talking about fulfill potential, that in itself as a phrase is potentially a useful phrase, but actually theory of change invites you to drill down into, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by fulfill potential? And as you get more specific, then your theory of change can often become more meaningful. Similarly, stronger communities, another phrase that's used a lot. Personally, I like it as a phrase, but I don't entirely know what it means, and it probably means a slightly different thing to every funder. One funder might be focused on improving relationships between different groups in a community. Another might be focused on, supporting communities within a place and developing infrastructure within a place. There's quite different interpretations of that. So ideally, your impact statement should really spell out what you mean by the impact that you're trying to achieve. And then mapping backwards, we take a step backwards from impact and we look at outcomes. These are the shorter term changes in your target groups that contribute to impact. So they often relate to how you want your target group. Again, this could be your grantees, it could be people in communities directly, or it could be other groups like policymakers, how you want these groups to be changed by your work. And it's useful to think here in terms of what resources, what assets, what strengths, or what capabilities will you aim to give people that will help them to achieve impact for themselves. So the example that we saw before about young people, the funder was through their work supporting young people to gain increased confidence, increased skills, and increased opportunities for work. Those are the kinds of things that you might see within outcomes. And it can be helpful to think about separating out knowledge, skills, attitudes, and behaviours. It's a framework that we often use to prompt people to think about the changes that you're wanting to see. Alternatively, the COM-B model, this is a behaviour change model. It suggests that capabilities added to opportunities, added to motivations, are what influence behaviours. So Going back to the young people example, you might want to be increasing their capabilities for work, so giving them the skills and the confidence for work. You might want to be creating opportunities for them to work, so that might be providing work placements. But you might also be wanting to think about how you can support their motivations for work, and you might have another stream of activities around that. And your theory of change might be that those three things combined add up to change their behaviour, increase them going into work, and support them to have more fulfilling jobs, as the theory of change that we looked at in the previous slide stated. We recommend that you use change words when you're thinking about outcomes. So things like improve, reduce, or increase. So rather than just saying young people have confidence, young people increase their confidence, because you're not wanting to suggest that they had no confidence to start with. What you're wanting to see is a positive change in a positive direction in terms of the confidence that hopefully they are growing in. And again, reduce there, you might be looking to reduce something that you see as bad, such as reducing reoffending rates amongst prisoners coming out of prison, for example. So it doesn't have to be positive in the sense of increasing. It could be something that you see as positive through reducing. And in terms of outcomes, what we often find is there's lots of different ways to express the same thing. So an exercise that we often do in this part of a theory of change process is we encourage people to start with a brainstorm and talk about all the outcomes that they think they want to see, and then try to whittle them down. So you might find that there are 5 different ways that people have said we want to increase young people's confidence, but actually it all essentially boils down to increasing young people's confidence. So you can then simplify that down for your theory of change. And then finally, as we map backwards, we move on to activities. And this is the activities that you, as I said earlier, or others deliver. These are usually the easiest part. What are you going to do? Or what are you already doing if you're doing a theory of change for an existing program or organization? So describe what your program does. Think about your activities apart from grant making here. So this might be providing training or support on organizational effectiveness. It might be undertaking research. It might be influencing policy. But many funders are either explicitly or implicitly doing activities other than grant making. So make sure that you keep a note of those as well. And when you're thinking about your grant making activities, you might want to think about particular features of your grant making. So we saw the theory of change for a responsive funder that was talking about having flexible funding, having longer term funding. You might want to talk about the particular way that you do your application process and how you think that's supporting grantees to have a better experience. But really, think about what your activities look like in a bit more detail here. And this language is a little bit different to the language for outcomes. So rather than the language of change, we're talking about the language of activities. So provide something, you provide funding, you support grantees, for example, you might run a program, you might offer additional training. Those are the kinds of words that you want to see in activities. And a good description will describe the most important features. So what are you offering? What will people be doing? How often, for how long, how will you recruit or attract your target group? It's important to say that not all of that detail has to necessarily go into a theory of change diagram. You might be thinking the diagrams, didn't show all of that, but what a lot of people do alongside their diagram is have a narrative that goes into a bit more detail on some of these features. So once you've gone back to activities, we actually suggest you go forwards again. This might seem a little bit counterintuitive, but this is where change mechanisms come in. And this is about how those activities should be experienced by your target groups. So by this point, you might have a very nice, neat theory of change diagram. You've got your activities leading to outcomes, leading to impact. But do you really know how that change is happening? This is where thinking about change mechanisms can be really key. Change mechanisms can be a little bit harder to define. There's a little bit of confusion between mechanisms and outcomes because they can have some slightly overlapping things. For example, when we say here, talking about what people are thinking, feeling, saying, doing, so you might be thinking, actually, some of my outcomes are also about what people are thinking, feeling, saying, doing. That's fine. But what we say in terms of change mechanisms is we're really thinking about how people are experiencing your work as it happens. So that might be on the day or in the moment. What are they thinking, feeling, saying, or doing as they fill out your grant application form, or as a young person experiences the charity service, in the case of a charity supporting young people? It often relates to things like feeling motivated, respected, in control, perhaps trusted, inspired, maybe feeling like they're not alone, or maybe feeling like they're not overwhelmed by their context. Those are the kinds of things that people can describe when you ask them how your work supports them. It can also involve things like listening, engaging, enjoying. I think that's one that is often overlooked. Where's the fun in it? How are people enjoying the process? It might involve your target groups thinking that something is relevant to their work. That's also very important. So if you're providing support or training for your grantees, you hopefully want them to think that it's relevant to their work, and that might be an important change mechanism for them engaging with that training support offer that you've got out there. If you want to read more about mechanisms of change, we've got a link to a blog there at the bottom of the slide, and that gives additional examples as well as setting out why we think it's so important for charities and funders to think about. And then, as I mentioned before, you might want to put this all together into a diagram. This is optional. So the diagram, like the kinds of diagrams that we've seen, will often have a series of different coloured boxes. So going from impact on the right, back to outcomes, mechanisms, and then activities on the left-hand side there. You will also want to think about where your situation analysis lives. So often we find that this works best as a narrative. So your theory of change document might actually be a narrative which sets out how you see the situation and sets out the target groups that you're looking to influence. You might then have a diagram showing activities, mechanisms, outcomes, and impact. You might then have a bit more narrative about what you mean by some of the things in your diagram, because not everything will fit into the diagram, or the diagram ends up looking like a bit of a mess. So there's no sort of right or wrong answer about how long this should be, but what's often useful, perhaps for a smaller funder, is to have something fairly brief, maybe a page on the situation analysis and target groups, maybe a page diagram for your theory of change, and then maybe another page of narrative about your theory of change. For a funder that's much bigger and trying to influence multiple target groups or multiple social issues, you might end up with a much bigger theory of change. And you might even have something like a systems map in there as well, rather than just having a narrative situation analysis. Great, and I can just see we've got a question about, do we have to measure the change mechanisms? That's an excellent question. And I've got a little bit in the presentation later about how you use your theory of change for measurement. I will just say now, what we say as a general rule is it's important to think about what's the most important thing to measure. So you don't have to measure everything. It can actually be really useful to measure some of those change mechanisms. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, it might be things like how your grantees are experiencing your application processes or experiencing your funding processes. That might actually be the kind of thing that you do want to ask in a grantee survey if there's an opportunity. You probably want to have an anonymous grantee survey for this, asking people in an anonymous way, how do you experience this? Or, how does this make you feel? What do you really think of our funding processes? And hopefully you'll get some honest answers if they know that it's not going to be linked back to them and their organisation's funding. But yeah, I can cover measurement in a bit more detail later on in the seminar as well. Finally, if you remember back to the 3-stage process, we talked about doing your situation analysis, zooming in to do your theory of change. You now need to zoom out to check your assumptions. And this is really looking at the theory of change itself and where your theory of change might be weak, untested, or uncertain, but also looking at the wider context for your work. So again, you might return to your situation analysis and just remind yourself of some of those features that you put aside at the beginning because you said they're not relevant to our theory of change. this is the moment to revisit that and remind yourself that actually you talked about things like what other stakeholders might be doing that might help or hinder your work. So you might have a core assumption in your work that you need other stakeholders to do something that supports you, or to not do something that undermines you. For example, if you're, again, taking the example of supporting young people into work, you might want to assume that the government doesn't change policy in a direction that you see as negative. But then by going back to that as an assumption, you realize, well, actually, that's not guaranteed unless we actually engage a policymaker. So maybe we actually want to do some research and get it in front of policymakers just to make sure that they know that this is a really important area. So that's where assumptions can help in terms of thinking about other stakeholders. You also want to ask yourself what factors outside your control might help or hinder your work. So again, that could be government policy, but it could be the wider economic or social environment. Obviously, at the moment, we've got a cost of living crisis, which many funders and others are thinking about how they respond to, and that often is hindering the work of funders because it's affecting the charities that you work with, and therefore affects your progress towards the goals that you want to see. So we're seeing at the moment a lot of funders thinking about how they can flex their work in order to support charities and the wider cost of living crisis. And if you're interested in more of that, MPC has published some work on the cost of living crisis with some pointers for funders. But another factor outside your control might be public opinion. And so again, if you're working with supporting young people and into work, there might be an important factor for you to think about in terms of, well, what's the public opinion on this? And because the public are also employers, how does that support employers to take on young people or to not take on young people? Are there perceptions around young people in work that perhaps hold them back? And if that's the case, then do you want to do something that tries to influence public opinion? Perhaps you want to fund a charity that's trying to do work on public opinion as well. And then what other contextual conditions might affect change? So what other factors in people's lives could affect their engagement with your work or indeed your grantees' work? I also like to ask people to think about what could go wrong. It's a question we arguably don't ask ourselves enough. Could your work have any unintended consequences? So an example of this might be that there is a backlash against your work from other actors. Perhaps you highlight an issue, or you support charities that are working on a particular issue, and then that creates a backlash from people that don't support the social change that you want to see. And if you're not careful, you could end up having some unintended consequences. So by thinking about what could go wrong at the outset, you can try to mitigate against some of those risks, or to work with your grantees and others to help them in their work to mitigate against unintended consequences. And then, of course, it's also really important here to think back about the process, which, as I said earlier, is really important to try to be as robust as possible. So did the team in the process have enough resources? Have different views been incorporated? For example, the views of people with lived experience of the issue, have those been reflected? You might not be able to involve them directly, but have you thought about how those views might get incorporated, whether that's through other research or other work that you or the charities you support have done? So asking who have you not heard from is an important question. And that's not to say you have to make sure you hear from everyone, but acknowledge who you haven't heard from and think about how that might relate to some of the assumptions in your work, or some of the evidence base that you drew on. Right, so I can see we've got another question in the chat. So Ralph asks, is the process most effectively delivered in or out of committee meetings? Yeah, another really interesting question. And I guess it depends on the nature of your committee meetings. And how those run. So we work with some funders that might have, say, an all-day committee meeting where they're able to spend a good few hours on something like a theory of change process alongside other committee business. I would say it's something that's very difficult to condense into a short period of time. So if you've only got a relatively short committee meeting, or you've got a lot of other business to cover, then I would just be wary of trying to do it in too short a time. But actually what you could do if you're short on time is just think about which part of the process would you most like the committee members to comment on. And actually you could just engage them in one step of the process. So it might be thinking about something like the outcomes that you want to see, or the impact, or indeed you might decide it's more effective to think about them feeding into the activities, or even the mechanisms of change. So I would say just think about how you can best use the expertise of committee members and what work you can do before and after a committee meeting. So that's, yeah, there's no right or wrong answer to that, but hopefully that helps you with a few pointers. Great. And so a quick summary, and after the summary I'll take a little pause again just to see if people have got further questions, because I've thrown a lot of different things at you. But just to summarize the process that we've been through, we've talked about zooming out to do your situation analysis, zooming in to do your theory of change, zooming back out to think about your assumptions. And then I'm just going to go back to this diagram that we showed early on, which is, don't forget what is needed to support this process. Someone who leads and brings it together, consultation of stakeholders. As Ralph mentioned, that could include committee members, it could include others, and thinking about how you incorporate a review of the evidence base into the process as well. So I'll take a quick pause here just to give everyone a breather and a chance to reflect on that and ask any questions in the chat before we carry on to how you might use theory of change in your work. So Giles has asked, in your experience, are there particular extra angles, approaches, etc., to theory of change which place-based funders should bear in mind? Again, a really interesting question, because I think when you're a place-based funder, you're often trying to influence a whole community, a whole place, a whole system. So I guess the thing that I would suggest you think about is, do you want to do something like a systems map? Is that appropriate for your work? Or do you want to do some sort of, as part of your situation analysis, really thinking deeply about the place? If it's not a systems map, there might be something additional there that you want to do in the situation analysis. When it comes to theory of change itself, you might well be thinking about outcomes for a place. And again, I have seen funders do this, and it can get a little bit conceptually complex. I think it can work if you're very careful about it. But again, going back to the example of stronger communities, I sometimes see funders want to create, say, stronger places or more cohesive places, or something like that. I guess what I would say is really think about what you mean by that. Different funders will have different models of what a strong place or a good place or whatever you're aiming for look like. But yeah, I would just encourage you to really think quite carefully in the outcomes about the kinds of things that you're looking for, and the kinds of activities that then might support that. MPC has also done some work on looking at place-based funding, which one of my colleagues might be able to post into the chat as well. And we talk about how actually there's quite a spectrum of place-based funding. So some funders are simply working in a place, and that's their context, if you like, for their work. And that obviously needs to be reflected in the theory of change. If you're a funder that just works in one county or one city, that's obviously the key context for your place. At the other end of the spectrum, some place-based funders are really aiming at whole-scale systems change within a place. And that's the end of the spectrum where you might want to be thinking in more detail about things like a systems map. Great. So I'm going to move on to the next section, and we can always come back to more questions at the end. So, and had some questions about this already in terms of impact measurement, but wanted to talk a little bit about how a theory of change can help you as a funder. So that might be in terms of strategy and prioritization. It might be in terms of impact measurement, monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And it might be in terms of things like communicating your aims and what you're trying to achieve. I'm going to talk in detail about the first couple of those, because those are the ones that we see as being really key to the work that we do with funders working on their theory of change. So first of all, theory of change isn't the same as strategy, but it does provide a foundation for strategy. So when NPC talks about strategy, we actually have what we call our strategy triangle, which is basically saying strategy is about finding the sweet spot between the three corners of the triangle. So that's your goals, your external environment, and your internal resources and capabilities. So you'll see from the conversation that we've just had that theory of change can talk a little bit about all of those, particularly when you're doing things like your situation analysis, you're getting into the external environment and your internal resources. However, theory of change helps the most with that first one, building your strategic goals. So it can really support you to build a shared vision of what you're trying to achieve. And really importantly, making the pathways towards your strategic goals more explicit and revealing some of those hidden assumptions. This in turn can support you to improve the design of your funding program by thinking seriously about the context, the target groups, your priorities, and your plans. So uncovering those hidden assumptions can hopefully make your program design more robust. It can also highlight strategic opportunities. So that might be links between different parts of your strategy. You might have several different funding programs, and when you put them all together in a theory of change, you can see that actually one part of your strategy is really supportive of another part of your strategy, or equally, you might realize where there are some gaps and you can better link them up. You might also find that the theory of change process highlights stakeholders to influence or collaborate with, or it might highlight changes in the external environment that you can capitalize on. Theory of change, the process itself, also encourages you to create an adaptive strategy. And this is something that MPC has been increasingly talking about in recent years. So rather than having a really rigid strategy, which is set in stone for the next 10 years, funders and charities are increasingly looking to really learn and adapt as they go. And theory of change can support you in this by identifying hypotheses to test along the way. So that process of identifying the interim or the intermediate outcomes helps you to know whether your strategy is on track. So you might still have a 10-year goal, but you might actually say, this is the change we want to see in 10 years or 5 years, whatever it happens to be. But these are the things that we hope we'll see along the way. And then when you're doing your strategy review process, which depending on your processes, you might do once a year, you might do once every few years, you can really look at whether you've been achieving those interim outcomes. And if not, then you might want to change course a little bit as you think about the next part of your strategy. So theory of change can be a really useful tool for keeping your strategy on track. It hopefully anchors the strategy in evidence where it is available. If the evidence isn't available, and this can be particularly the case for funders looking to set up a new program or looking to fund in an area that's really quite tricky, perhaps it's quite complex, or it's not really been done before, perhaps it's a new area, then your theory of change can equally identify where you need to build the evidence base to support your strategy. And theory of change can also support you to prioritize who to work with and what activities to undertake, which is a really important part of a strategy process. Often you have a lot of activities that you want to do, and theory of change can really support you to prioritize. So the next slide shows, this is a theory of change that we supported Friends Provident Foundation to do. This is published on our website in terms of their Building Resilient Economies program. We've got an evaluation report which includes this theory of change. And as part of this process, I'm not expecting you to read the whole theory of change, but the thing to note is that there are some stars on this diagram. So once we'd got the overall theory of change, the foundation identified what were priority outcomes for them, and you can see those identified by the purple stars on some of the yellow boxes. And this was particularly important for Friends Provident Foundation because they are a systems change funder. They had a lot of different outcomes, as you can see on this theory of change, that they were trying to achieve, working with a lot of different target groups. So everything from institutional investors to journalists, think tanks, policymakers, regulators. And so for them, this was a really important part of working out how they could best prioritize their work within their funding program. So that's strategy and prioritization. And thanks, Hector, for sharing the report on place-based funding. Seen that in the chat. And we also talk about how theory of change can support you to do monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So the theory of change process itself encourages learning. It's a really good first step in terms of aggregating the collective knowledge, sharing it across the group. It exposes different perspectives about an issue. It allows these to be debated and challenged and really tested. And that surfaces the assumptions underpinning people's views about how an initiative achieves change. So this really encourages teams to engage with the existing evidence base and models of how change happens. So we haven't really covered today models of how change happens, but there's various different models out there for philanthropists and funders. For example, trust-based philanthropy is one model of how change happens in terms of doing your funding. There are other models which we've touched on briefly, such as behavior change models, which are also quite interesting depending on the nature of your work. So just that very process of thinking about how change happens, you might find that you've engaged with some of these models, engaged with the existing evidence base, and hopefully that's got the whole team into a learning mindset. But also in the longer term, your theory of change provides a foundation for your monitoring and evaluation. And so that can highlight what needs to be measured and what does not, so that you can plan your evaluation questions and what data and evidence to collect. So in terms of thinking about what needs to be measured and what does not, again, it goes back to that existing evidence base. What I would say is that make sure that you don't try to measure things where there's already an existing evidence base, because you're basically wasting your time. But also, you might want to think about not measuring things that are very difficult to measure. So we actually say when you're thinking about the different components of your theory of change, you probably don't want to be measuring impact all the time. That's something to measure on an infrequent basis, because if you're trying to measure long-term impact and you've got an ambitious 5-year or 10-year impact goal, it might be very difficult to measure that on an annual basis. There are obviously exceptions to this rule. There might be impact goals that you've got where you do have monitoring systems in place, and it's part of your work to commission research. For example, going back to the young people example, you might have a labour market monitor where you're monitoring young people going into work, and you do have evidence on that. But if you're a systems change funder that has a very big lofty goal, so going back to the Friends Provident Foundation one, a fair, resilient and sustainable economic system in the UK, that's quite hard to measure all the time. That's a much sort of bigger piece to measure that. So yeah, I'm not covering that in detail today, because actually we've got another seminar next week, which I'll give a link to at the end of this seminar, which covers impact measurement in a bit more detail. But that's I guess just a very sort of brief overview of the sorts of things we're thinking about when we say what needs to be measured and what does not. But moving on to that second bullet point under monitoring and evaluation, actually just that very process of identifying intermediate outcomes allows you to gather evidence as you go about progress towards your goals. This can be particularly important if it's taking a long time, or if, for example, you're trying to influence policy and maybe policy is changing in an undesired direction. If you are looking at the intermediate outcomes in your theory of change, you can see that actually you are creating change despite the fact that you haven't yet reached your long-term goal. And that allows you to adapt your work as the context changes. And then it also acts as the basis for claims about your contribution to change. So I've underlined that because, as we mentioned earlier, it's often more appropriate for funders to be thinking about contribution rather than attribution. And this then helps you to make the case for your work to other stakeholders. Might be other funders if you're collaborating with other funders, or it might be your grantees. It might be people and communities directly themselves. As I mentioned, we've got another seminar next week that's going into a lot more detail on the funder impact cycle, but I'm just going to show you this to show how theory of change is the first step in the funder impact cycle. So you can see here, we talk about the funder impact cycle being plan, do, assess, review. And it's a circular diagram. So once you've finished and done your review, you go back to plan again. And theory of change is an essential step, or really useful step in the plan section, defining your theory of change, developing your evaluation and learning approach, and then communicating those evaluation and learning requirements to grantees. You will then go into the doing, making your grants, monitoring them, supporting grantees, enabling collective learning. You'll then take a step back and assess, so analyze the data that you're getting in, reviewing the feedback that you might have got on your performance as a funder, and sense making. Again, a bit of a systems change term there, thinking about making sense of the wider context or system for your work. You'll very likely review the implications for your strategy and delivery, share the learning with grantees, share the learning with the sector if applicable, and close the loop, so go back to planning again. And that's where you might want to revisit your theory of change and see if it still feels right, or if you want to change your theory of change, because actually some of the data and evidence that you're getting back suggests that your assumptions weren't quite right, or your overall theory of how change happens wasn't quite right. Maybe you had some gaps, or you had some assumptions that you hadn't quite tested. So that's the funder impact cycle. If you want to learn more, come to our next seminar on Tuesday, which is being led by my colleague Amina Ali, and she's going to be talking in lots more detail about evaluation and learning for funders and the funder impact cycle. I've put the link in there, or you can just go to MPC's website and click on the events page, and you should get through to that as well. We've also got further resources. So these are some of the key ones around theory of change for funders. We've got a theory of change for funders publication, which is a few years out of date now, but actually a lot of the key principles do still apply. More recently, we've done publications including Making Your Funding Go Further, and this goes much more into the detail of impact practice and theory of change for impact measuring, measurement and evaluation. We've got our theory of change in 10 steps guide that I mentioned. This is our much more comprehensive step-by-step guide to how to do a theory of change. It's not specific to funders. So again, you might want to go into it just sort of taking some of the stuff from this seminar, but using that as a key step-by-step guide if that's what you're looking for. We've also, and I think Hector's already put this one in the chat, got a guide to using theory of change for systems change, which many funders are increasingly thinking about. And we've got a collection of reports called More Than Grants, which goes into more detail about how funders can support grantee effectiveness and how funders can use their influence for good. And those reports are particularly useful when you're thinking about the change mechanisms. So how do you support grantee effectiveness? How do your activities create change? There's a whole load of funder case studies, for example, in that report, and similarly in the one on how funders can use their influence for good, either through supporting charities to campaign or through doing direct influencing work. I would really recommend those for getting ideas of how other funders have thought about these issues. And we did that work in conjunction with Lloyds Bank Foundation for England and Wales, who are a great example of a funder thinking about those issues as well. And then we've also, this is going a bit more into impact measurement. This is our resource on thinking about impact measurement for flexible funding, which again is something that funders are thinking about a lot as they think about things like trust-based philanthropy and what that means for theory of change and impact measurement. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I think we've got 10 minutes left for questions. I'm just going to look in the chat and see what questions we've got sent. Yes, Effie, the slides will be sent around afterwards. Apologies, I should have said that explicitly at the beginning, so you didn't all feel like you needed to scribble loads of notes. But yes, we will certainly share those afterwards. And yes, the link to the cost of living research published by MPC. Yes, we can certainly share that afterwards. And yeah, if there's time, put the link into the chat as well. Oh, thanks, Hector. You're on it already. Very efficient. And yeah, thanks, Cynthia, for your feedback. Did anyone else have any questions or comments? And feel free to, oh yeah, see another one coming in. So thanks, Adam. What are the most common pitfalls you see that cause funders' theories of change to fail? Wow, that's a big question. I will do my best to answer it in the time we've got. I think there's something about not going into detail about the assumptions and the change mechanisms. I would say those are the big two things that I think are underrated when you get into the theory of change. So actually really driving into how our work creates change and what are our assumptions about this. And so that could be that a funder hasn't uncovered an assumption about unintended consequences of their work or about other actors working in the space. But that's why I would really encourage you to make sure you take the time to think about the assumptions. There's also other pitfalls, such as trying to put too much detail in or not putting enough detail in. It's a really tricky balance to get, I would say. But I certainly see theories of change that are, I don't know, 100 different boxes, and you need to simplify down to that to get it to look a bit more meaningful and something that you can actually work with going forwards. If anyone else has got any ideas on pitfalls that you've seen in your work, feel free to put them in the chat as well. And Steph, yes, the slides will be shared as well as the recording. So we'll send all those round, as well as some of the links to resources that we mentioned. Great. And yeah, Jess, is theory of change something that is constantly evolving, or is the idea that you create it once and it stays as it is? Absolutely the former. We definitely recommend that your theory of change is constantly evolving. One of my colleagues used to have a slide which we used that had theory of change boxes set in stone, so recreated as rocks, and we had the slightly cheap gag that it shouldn't be set in stone. It should be something that is constantly evolving. Obviously, there's a little bit of a question about how often you revise it. You don't want to be revising it every day, so I would recommend thinking about key touch points, which might be when you're doing a strategy review, or when you've got some new data and evidence, such as data and evidence from your grantees to consider. That's a really useful touch point to think back about how you can evolve your theory of change. And Janice says, have a theory of change for our organisation. Would you recommend a separate funding one or combined? So I'm not sure if I understand your question, Janice. Perhaps you could unmute and just explain a little bit more. Do you mean that you've got a sort of a separate funding programme one, or could you just explain a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, hi. Yeah, so we've got a theory of change just for our specific organisation, which is just around the kind of outcomes for young people and kind of going through
Right.
the impact for those. But I work in the kind of funding strand, so I'm just wondering if it would be something that would be combined into the sort of overall theory of change, or whether it would be.
Okay, yeah. I see what you mean. Yes, you've got several activities. You work directly with young people, and then you've also got a funding stream. Yeah, okay, I get you. So, yeah, I guess I would recommend, if you can, do an overall one that shows at a very high level how those things fit together. But actually, what you probably want is to do separate theories of change that then feed into that bigger one. Just because I imagine those theories of change might look quite big, might look quite different, if that makes sense.
Right. Thank you. Thanks.
Great. Great, and we've just got another 5 minutes. So I'll see if anyone else has got any final thoughts or questions. Thanks, Ralph. Great, and I'll just take this opportunity to say thank you very much to my colleagues behind the scenes who have been helping out as well. So got Hector, who some of you have seen in the chat sharing links, and also Adrian and Rebecca from the events team who've been helping out behind the scenes as well. So thank you for all of that. Oh, and we've got one more question, so I will just see if I have time to answer that. What do you recommend for assessing the impact of an organisational developmental grant? Signpost to some materials. I would definitely say check out the More Than Grants report about organisational development, so how you can support grantees to develop their organisational effectiveness. And that was in the key resources slide. That will give you a few pointers on that. Yeah, glad to hear that people found it useful for your organisation. Do keep an eye out for the follow-up email, which will have our post-event feedback survey in. It's really useful for us if you can fill that out, because that helps us to know how to improve our seminars for the future. So keep an eye out for an email from my colleagues, including some of the key resources that we signposted today, the slides, the recording, and and there's the feedback survey for any of you that have a chance to do it right away, which is often the best way to do it. So if you've got a minute now before your next meeting or before going to get a cup of tea, then do please share your feedback whilst it's fresh. It's really valuable for us. Great, and it looks like we're coming to an end time-wise, so I will say thank you to everyone for attending. I'll just keep the chat open for a couple of minutes so that people can see the link to the feedback survey. But thank you for joining us today, and particular thanks for your questions. They were really good questions, so I always like it when I get some good, challenging questions and get to go into detail about some of those things. But great to have such an engaged group, and wishing you the very best of luck as you embark on your theory of change journey. Do feel free to reach out to me or anyone else at MPC if you'd like to discuss theory of change further. We're always happy to talk about theory of change and provide direct support to many funders on this topic. Thanks, and bye to those of you that are heading off.